Hi, this is Nicolas van Mieghem, and we're standing here live in Paris at the EuroPCR meeting for our annual Thoraxcenter wrap-up of PCR for Radcliffe. I'm standing here, of course, with Joost Daemen, my colleague and friend. And this was a long meeting, a lot of action for us. But we managed.
Yes.
And here is the wrap-up of the trials that, at least in our impression, was relevant for our practice and for future research. Let's first start with the COAPT substudy presented by Carr. I think we're all quite excited by the results of COAPT, and COAPT was probably the positive trial where MITRA-FR was a negative study. I think these sub-studies are important because they will give us further insight in how to interpret the data.
Especially given the discrepancies with the MITRA-FR, correct?
Exactly, exactly. So in the COAPT trial, the patients who were randomized to the MITRA clip, the majority of the patients ended up with a moderate or less severe MR. So the MR mitral regurgitation was moderate, mild, or none. And patients who managed to have a reduction in that magnitude, they did very well in terms of quality of life, heart failure hospitalizations, and they also had a better survival. Of course, as expected, more patients in the MitraClip arm managed to get those kind of reductions. If the patient in the control arm had some kind of reduction in mitral regurgitation, this was only transient, so hence the positive results of the study. This sub-study was followed by a statement by Bernard Prendergast.
Yes.
He was positioning there the statement from all the European societies, so to speak, where he basically reiterated the success of COAPT. They were suggesting that, of course, first, heart failure patients need to be optimally treated in terms of medical therapy, CRT, but functional MR is also a potential target for MitraClip. And if you want to proceed with MitraClip, the position paper is suggesting the criteria of the COAPT. So basically, the MR should be with an effective regurgitant orifice area of 30 millimeters square or above, and not 20 millimeters square or above, as was used in the MITRA-FR.
Exactly.
So that is, I think, an important
So we finally
loss.
get a little bit of distillation and how to interpret both studies and how to move forward. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think a lot of the cardiologists in Europe, they know very well the MITRA-FR trial, and they tend to forget the importance of COAPT, and then we end up in a status quo. So I think this was a necessary push for the community in general. This was followed by a preliminary analysis, a sneak peek into the data of the EXPAND trial. As you know, and as we discussed in our preview, the EXPAND trial was dealing with the third generation of the MitraClip, so an NTR and XTR, especially the XTR was of interest from my perspective, because we're talking here about longer clip arms, so it should be easier to clip the leaflets. But also, I was anticipating at least less clips. Indeed, more than one clip in lesser patients. Well, that came as a little bit of a surprise. So first of all, the procedures were safe, okay. The success rate was quite high, so only 4% of the patients ended up with more than moderate MR in 400 patients, not so bad. But 44% of the patients required more than one clip. That's amazing. And also what was notable was that 40% of the patients also were treated with the smaller clip, not with the large clip. So I think maybe if...
Initially, or as a second clip?
No, as a first clip.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was also a surprise. So at least that also is not corresponding with our practice. We're typically using the large clip, and the small clip is only in selected cases.
Exactly.
So the last trial related to the clip technology was the TRILUMINATE. TRILUMINATE was presented by George Nicolas and was focusing on a clip therapy for tricuspid regurgitation. And this was a dedicated clip that was modified for the tricuspid valve. Intriguing results, 85 patients. They were introducing like a new scoring of tricuspid regurgitation, because all of a sudden we see severe, massive, and torrential TR, and of course the majority of the patients in the study had that kind of TR. There was a reduction in the majority, almost all the patients ended up with some kind of an improvement in their TR, but still 44% of the patients had at least severe tricuspid regurgitation. The effect was associated with a moderate improvement in quality of life, with a KCCQ improvement of 14. I think this is an important signal. I think clipping will become a treatment option for patients with severe TR. I think we also need more data, and we need to refine this procedure a bit further, because there was no information on imaging tools and so on. So more to come in the future.
Yeah. No, I agree. Good. So more on Tuesday on the field of drug-eluting or drug-coated balloons, actually. So this was actually quite interesting, because as you know, I mean, last year there has been this meta-analysis from Greece showing that if you pull over 4,000 patients treated with drug-coated balloons or paclitaxel-coated stents for peripheral artery disease, there was an increased risk for mortality up to 5 years. So this year at PCR, there was Alexandra Lansky who actually provided us with a statement in which they commented on these results.
And don't tell me this is associated with more mortality.
Well, no, I think what she did was at the end, I think, a good move from at least a scientific perspective. So what they did is that they really focused on the methodological issues with this study. So as you know, I mean, this was a study using aggregate data. So for this meta-analysis, 80% of the patients had no 5-year follow-up. There was no patient-level data. There was a mixture of paclitaxel-coated balloons and stents. So she really down-tuned the importance of this study.
And for a good reason.
For I think methodologically definitely a good reason. She also called for the fact that at present there might not be enough scientific support to underscore the recommendations currently brought out in order to stop the drug-coated balloon for peripheral artery interventions. However, there will be a new FDA panel on this in June, in which all the investigators of all the trials were really urged to collaborate in order to collect really patient-level data in order to be able to provide us with some more adequate and perhaps some more scientifically sound findings on this potential additional risk of mortality.
But fill me in here. If there is a higher risk for mortality, does that mean that the paclitaxel being used in these peripheral arteries is toxic?
Well, I think that is something that definitely needs more study in case this is really true. For me, it's hard to believe. I mean, we have so many years of experience with these devices in the coronaries, in which there was no signal in terms of increased mortality. Yeah. It does, however, remind me of the ESC firestorm in 2006, which started the exact same way, by meta-analysis of aggregate non-patient level data showing that DES first generation increased risk of death in MI, and when we glued and pooled all the patient level data from the first randomized trials, no sign. So I hope, and I can imagine that the same thing will happen.
That's a nice analogy. Yeah. Also, drug-coated balloons in coronaries?
In coronaries, 2 studies. So there was basket small, as we anticipated in the preview, showing that also in an angiographic sub-study of this trial, the drug-coated balloon actually performed quite well, numerically a bit higher rates of lumen loss, but still non-inferior to the stent, so actually performing quite well. But a second study, which I would like to highlight, which I found really interesting and original, was the Revelation study, which is a relatively sized randomized study performed in Amsterdam and presented by Nicolas Vos, in which they randomized 120 patients with STEMI to either drug-coated balloon technology versus let's say, 3rd generation DES, with an original endpoint being FFR at 9 months. So what the primary findings showed was that if you follow up these patients at 9 months, there was angiographically as well, there was no difference in FFR, if I'm correct, 92 versus 91, so that's very high. But also in terms of safety and efficacy, there was 2 versus 1 TLRs in both groups, with no evidence of death in MI in both cohorts. So
But then again, 18% of the patients required a stent.
18% of the patients had bailout stenting. On the flip side, you could say acute myocardial infarction, in which 82% of the patients had no stent, which at the end is perhaps associated with stent-related adverse events.
So, and what was the mortality in this
Mortality trial? 0 in both arms.
That sounds like suspicious.
That's suspicious for a trial in which you include STEMI patients, in which you would expect at least a mortality rate of 1 to 2% within 30 days already. So this is...
So I think it is definitely a cool trial from the AMC, but I would say let's be careful with over-analyzing and over-interpreting this.
I agree.
Because patient selection is on the corner, and also I think it still might be a chance effect here because of the relatively small number of patients.
Could be, but I still find this very original, and I think this definitely will get some continuation in future trials.
For sure. Jules, what about Professor Serruij's performance during the late breakers?
Yeah, so obviously he was present again during also PCR 2019. This year he presented actually a non-predefined subgroup analysis on global leaders. So as you recall, 16,000 patients, huge study. And what they showed is that they did a subgroup analysis in complex lesions. So this actually followed, I think, the guidelines of last year, telling us that if you have a complex lesion, which was defined as bifurcation with 2 stents, 3 or more lesions treated, 3 or more stents used, bifurcations with 2 stents, you really had a higher ischemic risk for future events. Mm-hmm. So when they applied these definitions to global leaders, actually what they found is that in these patients, all of these patients had a significantly increased risk of future adverse ischemic events, so confirming actually the tables in the guidelines. But interestingly, they also had an increased risk for BARC 3 and 5 bleeding. Mm. So that put into the perspective of the global leader study, they did a heterogeneity analysis to test for the difference in the treatment effects between complex and patients without complex characteristics, and there was a significant value. So I think although the analysis was not predefined, it at least, let's say, warrants additional analysis for these justifies, I should say, additional analysis in these subgroups. And what the trial showed that in a patient with complex lesions, so strategy of ticagrelor monotherapy for 2 years followed by 1 month of DIPT was significantly better as compared to standard regimen of platelet inhibition. So that I think is interesting. So this definitely shows some heterogeneity in the trial results. While in patients without complex lesions, there was no benefit of the prolonged ticagrelor. The issue I have with this trial is that it's very interesting, and it proves the concept of the more potent P2Y12 inhibitor being potentially better in terms of reducing ischemic events. But how these results will be implemented into our daily practice is something that I'm curious to see.
Well, I think that the scientific value is maybe not so dominant here, but the practical value is quite interesting, and I think it's fair to say that it's safe to use one of the potent antiplatelet therapies in monotherapy in high-risk patients.
Yes.
So I think that
without an additional cost in terms of bleeding. So that was a very important finding as well.
So again, well done for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, what else do we have?
So on Wednesday then, so that's the next day of the Congress with a lot of late breakers, again in the structural space, so maybe you want to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, there was the Jena valve trial, at least a preliminary peak in 12 patients from 12 patients from the 60-patient European Jena valve trial, where they evaluate this redesigned Jena valve for patients with pure aortic regurgitation. I think in those 12 patients, what you can say in 12 patients, but Jena valve works in pure AR. Only,
was safe.
Yeah, only 2 patients had mild PVL at 30 days, so that's quite encouraging. 1 patient required a pacemaker. There was 1 conversion to surgical aortic valve replacement. We're still there early in the game for pure AR, so I'm not surprised. I think these data are really encouraging. So I have quite some expectations for the future for this clipping technology.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. This was actually the first study thus far really focused on patients with pure AR, so quite interesting. So
other trials, one interesting one and an important one, I think, was the FORWARDPRO. FORWARDPRO was the largest trial on the Evolute Pro design. So this is the latest self-expanding design with a sealing wrap. The trial was presented by Professor Grube, and I think it met the expectations. 639 patients. The STS score was above 4. 1 in 3 of the patients were frail. So I think I believe these patients were still a little bit on the high end of the risk spectrum. 30-day mortality was around 3%. The stroke rate was around 2%. 18% pacemaker rate. Patients moderate PVL in between 1 and 2%, mild PVL in 39%. I think no shocking data here, but not bad either. Not shocking, not bad either, but this obviously is a third generation of this product. Do you think it's a true improvement? Based on what you've seen here, or do you require more data? Well, I think it's it's a good product, let's put it that way. But I think there is room for improvement, and I think especially if we want to go to lower risk patients, younger patients, you might want to have a product that is associated with less pacemakers and maybe is even more powerful in terms of PVLs. So we'll see what the future brings, and I don't believe that Medtronic will stand still with
for sure not
design either. Good. And then lastly, I also would like to reference Picardia's Leaflex technology.
Yeah.
So we already alluded to it in our preview. We were quite excited with this scoring technology to modify the aortic leaflets. The results were a little bit iffy. I think there is no doubt this is interesting technology. I have, again, quite some expectations for the future. But you know, they were struggling with their first design. They redesigned the product during the study. During the study, we're still talking about a limited number of patients, only 16. In those patients, they find significant improvements in valve areas from 0.8 to 1.2. PVL was present in 2 patients, but there were also some issues. So in 5 patients, they were not able to do the scoring therapy. I think that tells me that we need to wait for more patients, but also we should give this company the time to get their new improved design in practice. So I have no doubt more to come in the future.
No, for sure, I agree.
So finally on Wednesday, some data also on the Amulet device?
Yes, and this was eagerly awaited because we all have experience with the Watchman. So only one device was predominantly being used in Europe and outside of Europe. Now we have for the first time data from a large observational study using the Amulet left LAA occlusion. This is a vulnerable group of patients, so I think it was very valuable to have some kind of an alternative to an existing technology. So over 1,000 patients were included in this study.
That's a lot for a study like this.
Yeah, but it was needed because, of course, with the Watchman experience we have first of all the clinical experience is quite vast, but also the trial experience is also significant. Well, now over 1,000 patients, the CHEST-VASc score was 4, so that was definitely a patient population at risk for stroke. The expected stroke rate was more than 6% per year, so quite significant. Well, the procedural safety was excellent. Pericardial effusions or tamponade in less than 2% of the cases. A stroke, 0.4% early stroke rate, so very favorable. And the late events were also quite impressive. The stroke rate was 2% per year, with an expected stroke rate of 6% per year, so that's nice. 20% of the patients were no longer taking any antiplatelet therapy in the long run. The remainder were on single antiplatelet therapy, so quite good results, and I think it also confirms clinical use nowadays.
I agree.
Good. So far Wednesday, Thursday. So Thursday started with some follow-up data on BRS registries. But I think what stood out most to me were the data of the MIRAS trial. So there actually were 2 presentations. One by Alexander Abizaid, who presented the MIRAS-1 Extend data of, if I'm correct, 64 patients with present 2-year follow-up, and then there was the MIRAS-1 full trial with 2-year imaging and 3-year clinical follow-up data. Now, of a device which actually just got CE mark approval this week, so also the people from the company were quite enthusiastic, and I think this was justified. If you look at the trial data, I mean, it's a study looking at 107 patients with 64 in the Extend. Virtually only 2 endpoints in the 107, so one mortality and 2 TLRs. So very good clinical results up to 3 years. Interesting also from an OCT perspective in those patients that had follow-up, that there were no signs of scaffold shrinkage. So the MSA went from 6.02 to 5.7 or something, if I'm correct, but definitely no signs of scaffold deformation or shrinkage. The only thing what I really found, again, striking for new BRS technology, that over 75% of the patients had no imaging follow-up. Just angiography or clinical follow-up. I think that for me this is still hard to believe, that you present data on 14 patients with OCT at the end. That, for me, is a miss.
But especially if you have this safety signal with other technology.
I agree, and
this is a missed opportunity, and I think it reinforces the ESC statement.
I agree.
So that we should not be using these devices outside of the trial context.
Yeah, no, I.
So let's not talk about BVS because we're not using that in our practice anyway.
No, and there were more trials. I think looking at physiology, which got a lot of attention during this meeting, there were several things I think that should be highlighted. One thing, I think, the first thing that I would like to address were the. So again, some new data from Changzheng 2 from China, who is really doing a lot of good work in terms of a new, let's say, simplified computational fluid dynamics, shear stress. He did much of the work for the basics of the MEDIS technology, for the QFR. He published the initial studies with the technology, but now also extended the use of this algorithm into the use of either OCT and CT. So what he presented was a study in which they validated the use of OFR, as they call it, so which is an OCT-based FFR. So by automatic contour detection of the OCT, they were able to predict FFR in a series of, I believe, 107 patients, in which they found a correlation of 0.84%, which is very close to what we find with IFR and also what we find with QFR or VFFR. So that to me was interesting because this technology really allows you to get a physiological assessment with anatomical intraluminal assessment at the same time. But perhaps even more striking was the fact that the algorithm was also applied to the to CTs that were made. So applying these same, more or less these same rules, they use their own CT data in order to generate FFR. So something you know from the HeartFlow algorithm. But what they showed is that by doing these analyses themselves, so within their own institution, they needed 18 to 19 minutes per patient in order to come up with the FFR that highly correlated to invasive measurements. So I think this is interesting.
I see competition.
I see competition as well. Please remember, this is Chinese technology, and I mean, obviously conflicting with American patents. So I'm really curious to see how this will evolve in the future. I mean, still 19 minutes is I mean, not enough for ad hoc calculation, but I mean, we're talking about CTs here, done in a pre-procedural setting.
But it will need reproducibility outside of China.
Exactly.
Otherwise,
exactly. I mean, this is early work showing feasibility. No mentioning was made about clinical use commercially, so I think this is something that deserves to be followed up.
FFR-search?
FFR-search, something that at least we looked out for since this trial we obviously have been doing in the Erasmus for the last 3 years. Actually, just Thursday afternoon, Roberto Diletti had the chance to present the 2-year data during a late-breaking session.
The primary endpoint?
The primary endpoint. And so this actually was an analysis focused on all patients, so all 1,000 patients included, looking at the MACE rate, being a broad definition of all-cause death, any MI and any repeat revasc in patients with a post-PCI FFR, measured with the novice microcatheter below 0.90 or above 0.90. So what we found was actually quite interesting because we found that there was a clear numerical trend in increased event rates in those patients with decreased FFR, so below 0.90. However, no statistical significance. There was, although, a clear trend towards significance in those with MI and stent thrombosis, with higher rates in those with lower rates of FFR. But I think interesting, it confirms the findings of previous trials, at least in a numerical setting. But in this case, in a study which is clearly different because it really included all comers, STEMIs, patients with CTOs, diabetics, groups of whom we know that they have higher post-PCI FFR values. So I think we need to scrutinize the data a bit more.
Yeah, so more granularity is needed. And just to say, when we look at the cutoff of 0.90, there was a clear trend towards less myocardial infarctions, more stent thrombosis, and if we set the cutoff at 0.85, there were significantly less myocardial infarctions. So I think there is definitely something there, and I also wonder what would have happened or how the data would have looked like if we would have used 1,000 patients excluding STEMIs. So 1,000 patients without having STEMIs in the cohorts. So I think coronary physiology after PCI makes a lot of sense and probably might help us improve our PCI outcome. That's why I look forward to the FFR React trial that we're currently doing? And
Yeah.
how long do you think that will take for
Well,
its enrollment?
I guess the inclusion will be finalized within Q3 or early Q4 this year, so with an endpoint to be expected summer end of next year. So definitely something I think to look out for.
Great, great.
So far, coronary physiology, I think it would be nice to wrap up with 2 trials also from our side on the
First, the balloon
heart
pump?
failure field, yes.
The balloon pump, is it dead?
So balloon pump dead, no. I think Korsi and Daniel had the chance to present the outcome of actually a randomized trial of the use of the balloon pump in patients with shock, in patients not coming with direct ischemic complications, so shock out of the settings of the acute MI, in which he showed that if you use a balloon pump as compared to an increased strategy of using inotropes and diuretics in patients with shock, is that the use of a balloon pump was associated with a significantly improved central venous oxygen saturation, a lower need for the need to increase inotropes and diuretics, more positive fluid balance. So overall, very positive results when patients with shocks were treated with the balloon pump, and in early stage, ones arriving in cardiogenic shock.
Wow.
So promising, and also food for thought. And I think this trial will also be the basics form the basis for perhaps somewhat larger studies extrapolating these findings also with clinical endpoints.
So the last trial that I want to highlight is, of course, the study by Koen Amulet, our fellow who is finalizing his fellowship in the Thoraxcenter and is now moving to the great center in Genk in Belgium. So he presented the salvage trial, 330 patients with a witnessed cardiac arrest during an elective PCI. The entire
11 sites, right? So that
11 sites and over 110,000 patients.
Yeah, that's a great achievement.
An event in 1 in every 344 PCI. So the event rate is not that high. But after all, the complexity is quite significant because these patients, a lot of them will die. So the mortality was more than 50%. And the predominant cause of the cardiac arrest was some kind of a technical difficulty during the procedure. Unfortunately, there are we were not able to identify any bailout maneuver that would make a difference. And I think there is the solution. We need to use more mechanical circulatory support up front. So this is maybe a good argument in favor of mechanical circulatory supported PCI. With that, I would like to close our wrap-up of the 2019 EuroPCR meeting. I enjoyed the meeting. It was hectic.
We had a great time.
But now it's time for a beer, right?
I think we have to do so.
So thank you very much for your attention and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.